What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to Spawn Guides, the series where I analyze all of the spawn locations as well as their behavior on every map in Advanced Warfare. In the last episode, we covered the general spawn behavior for Team Deathmatch using the map Riot as an example. Now for this part of that episode, we are still going to be covering Riot and using that as our example, but this time we're talking about the general spawn behavior in Domination. Let's get into it. Alright guys, so in Domination, the spawns actually don't behave too much differently than Team Deathmatch. The one big difference though is we now have flags, and spawns generally seem to be attached to a certain flag. So if you hold the A flag for instance, you are generally going to be controlling the spawns that are attached to the A flag, and an enemy is not likely to spawn at one of those A spawns as long as you hold that flag. So let's have a look at the general spawn logic in Domination that I can see based on my analysis. So just like with Team Deathmatch, there are certain influencers on spawns. And just like in Team Deathmatch also, the number one influencer still seems to be enemy proximity as well as line of sight. So if an enemy is within proximity to a spawn point or they have a line of sight on a spawn point, that spawn is going to be deemed unsafe for you and you will therefore almost never spawn there. Now I do say almost never, and I said this a lot in the first episode, but I really want to hammer this in the first couple episodes so I don't have to repeat it so much throughout the rest of the series. We are worried about the spawns in this series that are happening most of the time. We're not worried about those extremely rare situations where an enemy watches you spawn or you watch them spawn. These situations aren't so rare in certain game modes, but in Team Deathmatch and Domination they are quite rare. So those are still the two most important influencers. I know I kind of grouped them into one there, but those are two different influencers, I'd say, enemy line of sight as well as enemy proximity. The second biggest influencer in Domination appears to be that spawns are generally attached to the flags that you hold. So if you're only holding the C flag, you're almost always going to be spawning at a C spawn unless an enemy or enemies have pushed in and are within proximity or line of sight to those C spawns. Then your spawn will probably be flipping. But most of the time, if you hold the C flag, you're going to be spawning at the C spawns. Now the final spawn influencer in Domination appears to be quite weak compared to the others. It doesn't really seem to play much of a role. This is very similar to Team Deathmatch, and that is teammate anchoring. If the general mass of your team or your entire team is pushed away from your flag, even if the enemies aren't holding that flag, it will sometimes anchor that spawn to somewhere near them. Now, how much of this actually has to do with the fact that because your team is pushed away from their spawns, that there's an enemy in your spawn blocking those spawns off and therefore it has to pick a different spawn? I don't know. I don't know how much of a role that plays. But if your entire team is pushing, let's say, one side of the map, even if they don't hold a flag there, it is likely that you will get a spawn near them. Now, this situation isn't going to happen too often on the map that we're looking at today, and that map is Riot. So with Riot, the flags are laid out in a linear fashion. So that means it's always going to be kind of pushing and pulling for map control rather than like a circular movement around the map, which tends to happen when you have a triangular flag layout. So the spawns in Riot are going to behave a little bit differently than the spawns on, say, Instinct, but I will definitely be getting to maps with a triangular flag layout in future episodes. So with the map Riot, the spawns are actually quite simple most of the time. We have the A flag, the B flag, and the C flag, just like any map in Domination, but like I said, these are linear. So therefore, these spawns that you can see right here are going to be the spawns that you'll spawn at almost every single time throughout the game. Unless there's some really serious action going on one end or the other, these are the spawns you're going to spawn at, and these are the spawns your enemies are going to be spawning at. Throughout this series, I'll be referring to these as primary spawns. You'll probably notice that none of these primary spawns are B spawns, and the explanation for this is pretty simple and straightforward. The action on a linear map tends to be in the middle of the map, and since we'll have players from both sides in the middle of the map somewhere battling it out, it's very likely that those spawns are just going to be blocked off most of the game. So that's why we have no primary spawns in the middle of the map around the B flag. So if you're holding the A flag, guess where you're going to be spawning most of the time? Well, it's at one of those 4 A spawns. Similarly, if you hold the C flag, you're going to be spawning at one of those 4 C spawns almost every single time. Which one of these spawns are you going to spawn at? I don't know. To be completely honest, I don't know, and I don't feel like it really matters all that much when you're actually playing the game, does it really matter if they're spawning on the spawn in the bottom left corner or the one right next to it? It doesn't matter to me really, as long as you can predict the general area that they're spawning at. Are they spawning at one of the A spawns or one of the C spawns? Then that's really all you need to know as far as the game is concerned. The game almost seems to select between these spawns at random. I really have a hard time predicting which one of these primary spawns it's going to be, and it really doesn't matter. So those are the primary spawns on Riot. It's pretty simple. They're either going to be spawning at one end of the map or the other most of the time. What about the other times though? What about the exceptions? Well, let's bring up the most popular secondary spawns. Now I do say the most popular secondary spawns, but they really aren't all that popular, especially compared to the primary spawns. Just to put this in perspective, as kind of a guess based on my hours of analysis of these spawns, you'll be spawning at a primary spawn about 90% of the time. Then about 9.5% of the time, you'll probably be spawning at one of these secondary spawns, and that other 0.5% of the time, it'll be some other random spawn on the map. We are not even going to mention the 0.5% of the times because those situations are almost impossible to predict anyways. There has to be so much going on for that to be able to happen. So when do we actually get these secondary spawns rather than a primary spawn? Well, this is when you have one player or an enemy player pushing in towards your primary spawns and putting pressure on those primary spawns. So when you have an enemy that's starting to get within those proximity or within a certain line of sight to your primary spawns, then it will very easily select a secondary spawn as long as that secondary spawn is safe. So just as a quick example here, let's just say the green team holds C and B, the red team holds A, and we have a green player kind of pushing that top left side of the map there. He's pushing towards a garage. Well, he's starting to put a little bit of pressure on those primary spawns. He's about to have a line of sight on all of those primary spawns, and he's kind of getting within that proximity. So instead of continuing to spawn the red players at the A spawns, the primary A spawns that is, it still wants to spawn them to an A spawn because it does have that flag attachment. So it's not like Team Deathmatch where it's suddenly going to flip them to the C spawns on the other side of the map. It still wants to spawn them around A. So it's going to pick one of those secondary spawns as long as they're safe. So in this particular situation, as you can see, both of those spawns on the bottom half of the map are safe. And that's where he's going to force those spawns to just by pushing up into the garage area. So if you spawn at one of these secondary spawns like that, that should tell you that there is an enemy pushing the garage side of the map, and you should be aware of that. Similarly, just looking at it from the other side now, if we have a red player pushing up on this side of the map, way up on the top right-hand side of the map, he's starting to put pressure on those primary C spawns, and therefore, as long as that one C secondary spawn is safe, it's very likely that the C players are going to be spawning at that secondary spawn rather than the primary spawns. So that pretty much covers when you'll be spawning at one of the secondary spawns that are attached to either the A or the C flag. What about all those little blue spawns that are attached to the B flag? Well, these ones are actually quite rare. You don't see these ones nearly as often as the other secondary spawns, but you'll get these spawns if you only hold the B flag. And with a linear map like this, that doesn't happen too often, and when it doesn't happen for long. So just be aware, if your enemy is only holding the B flag and your team holds A and C, it's very likely they'll spawn somewhere in the middle of the map, even if it's within a proximity to you or one of your teammates. So that pretty much covers it for the domination spawns on Riot. It's very simple. Most of the time you'll spawn at a primary spawn and your enemies will spawn at a primary spawn. If you start spawning at a secondary spawn, it's very likely that an enemy has been putting pressure on your primary spawns. And on the other end of that, if you're pushing towards the enemy's primary spawns, be aware of those secondary spawns as you get kills, because that's likely where they're going to end up spawning. So that's going to wrap it up for part 2 of episode 1 of Spawn Guides. From now on, things are going to be a lot more condensed. I'm not going to be explaining that general spawn behavior for Team Deathmatch and Domination, and I'm planning on covering both Team Deathmatch as well as Domination in a single episode for each map. Let me know in the comment section below which one of the maps you'd like to see me cover next. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.